Welcome back, folks, to episode 80 of the Running Man Self-Regulation Skills Project podcast with me, your host, Dr. Armando Dominguez, PhD in health psychology, licensed professional counselor, and an adjunct professor at a local community college. And what we're going to be discussing today has to do with a very important thing called vicarious learning or observational learning. Now, this isn't a big mystery in psychological circles, but it is mysterious in how powerful and the way it works whenever we are learning new skills. So we're going to get in depth with a couple of details involving learning, also how this relates to self-regulation skills because it is quite involved, and also on top of that, how can we leverage this to learn how to regulate not only self, but also develop new skills. So from that jump off point, we will start the discussion. The first thing I want to mention is that whenever we are very small, and let's take this into the paleo-primordial times whenever we were simpler creatures in the sense that we were cave people, hunter-gatherers, this sort of thing. And whenever we had children, for instance, much of what they did, they had to learn at the hands of mom initially once they were being breastfed and carried and swaddled, that sort of thing, close to the body. They weren't let go very far, but much of what was done was by viewing, by observing what was going on outside of ourselves. But the important part about this is that it's a very powerful learning skill because often, and I've talked about this before, we have a level of understanding when we're toddlers that if we can hide something and advantage ourselves, we will. It's not learned. It's not dishonesty. It's not necessarily being deceitful, but rather it's a survival orientation having to do with payoff called dopamine that says this feels good. But also, if we've ever been hungry or experienced hunger, often we tend to be more apt to save our food if we have extra, hide it from others that we know, and we make that connection that they'll be hungry and maybe eat our food and then we'll be hungry later. And that is one of those things that we have to pay attention to, having to do with, well, where does observational learning come in as far as learning skills and self-regulatory skills, because it's very closely tied. Now, the reward centers in the body and in the brain have to do with dopamine receptors, being able to receive the dopamine neurotransmitter to go ahead and set off the cascade of not only feel good, but also behaviors, but also that sense of cognitive focus if it is something that tastes good, such as if somebody gives you a cookie and that tastes good and you know where the cookies are kept. I'm going to remember where they're at, even if they seem to be trying to put them out of reach. I'm going to find a way to get to those. And that kind of conditioning says, remember this, that tasted good. And the feel good that comes from the good taste also indicates that we're surviving. We somehow won in the survival sense, not like game points on the board, but rather I'm above ground, sucking wind, breathing, and I'm alive. I survive, therefore I have thrived, and I win, in quotes, in the truest sense, once again, but not in a zero-sum game, but rather life itself. So that being the contextual point, let's go and look at what vicarious learning does whenever we are learning. Often whenever we are picking up a new skill, it's not always something that we've inherited, like, heartbeat and body temperature regulation that we don't necessarily have to learn, that is just part of our software, but rather when we're learning how to do something that'll bring us survival opportunity and advantage, sometimes we have to see somebody else doing it. We may have an ingenious way of doing things and figure stuff out on our own, kind of like whenever the monkey was sticking the branch down the hole that we see chimpanzees do now, and we as humans still do to draw ants out of ant hills, if that's what we're going to be eating on the Kalahari. And we do very similar things. So we have tool-making capacity, problem-solving capacity, and this will allow us to leverage whatever we have available to us materially to increase our survival chances. We don't always have to see somebody do it, but if we do, we're more apt to see it. Now, this isn't particularly distant, but it is kind of a jump, but something to think about in a more esoteric sense. Whenever the 100th monkey principle was published on many years back, There were some scientists that were studying macaque monkeys on some of the islands in Japan, and these are the little guys that tend to steam bath when it's cold in the hot springs, that sort of thing. And often sweet potatoes are left there by researchers so they can observe behavior for those that would be pursuing research in not only monkey behavior, but also degrees, which is a behavior, by the way, that's being also conditioned and reinforced. But whenever the 100th monkey principle came about, they noted that there was a monkey that would wash off the sand from their sweet potato in the water. And of course, they don't like that grit and grain in their teeth, and that makes nothing but sense. But from the tactile sensitivity perspective, that makes all kinds of sense. And it's not really deep reasoning, but it certainly is reasonable to think about it. And definitely a survival advantage. Your teeth last longer, less breaks, that sort of stuff, and less discomfort. So definitely a hedonic response, or pursuing pleasure, avoiding pain and discomfort. Nothing but sense, biological sense right there, survival sense. So whenever the 100th monkey effect occurred, monkeys on one island learned the washing from this one that started washing the sweet potatoes, and there were others on other islands. And these little guys didn't have cell phone technology. They didn't have cell phones, or even landlines for that matter, nor did they have letters going on boats to the other little monkeys on the other islands. And I am being weird right now and being funny, but just to make the point that at some point there was something within the ether of the field of information that was being passed that was considered a critical tipping point, a critical mass level that occurred such that all the other monkeys on the other islands started doing the same behavior without being shown how. Scientists didn't demonstrate. They basically were just feeding them and watching them. And the whole point of the exercise wasn't the observational study of who's washing their sweet potatoes. That's just what they did to draw them out so they could observe the behaviors. But that 100th monkey principle has to do with observation occurring at some level, but yet it's a very deep effect. But a strange parallel, no less, but something interesting to note. So further back to the argument that I was making earlier about vicarious learning being a very powerful thing. Evidently, it occurs in the animal kingdom. Much of what occurs in the animal kingdom is inherited. They're genetic programs that we get to survive. But even the higher primates, wherever they learn by watching and observing, get it. But we as humans, the highest of the primates, does the same. We're human animals. And no, I'm not calling you an animal, nor am I calling you a filthy animal, but here we go. We're still very similar in that our neurotransmitters, such as acetylcholine, that is used for forming memory, is the same kind of acetylcholine that a fly, such as Drosophila melanogaster, would use to form memory. And we've studied that, so not so different. And the reason I mention that is that problem solving is involved. So if we're learning something, chances are it's maybe not a problem, but a conundrum, maybe a question, or something we wonder if it can be done. Maybe we have a question to answer. And by observing others, we may note if those questions have been answered, especially if somebody's doing those things that maybe we can't do just yet. And this takes us to the next point, and this has to do with the levels of learning. And from learning theory, we have the stages of learning, and this is very clear and distinct, and it will play into what it is we're discussing today. And that is the very first level of knowing, or more correctly, unknowing or not knowing. We'll call this a level of ignorance. Ignorance is not stupid, it is educable. That just means we don't have that information available at this point. And if we are ignorant of something, that means we're not aware of it. So the first level of learning is the unconscious incompetence. That means I'm not aware and I have no skill in it, if there is a behavior or a skill to be learned. The level after that, once something comes into your awareness, that's when we cross over out of the massive realm of I don't know it exists into the realm of existence, things existing in my awareness, called the conscious incompetence level. I'm aware of it. I just can't do it if it's a skill, but I know it exists and it's there and I've seen it. And whenever this occurs, there is something within the vicarious learning and also within the two learning levels that occurs, and that has to do with newness and novelty. It draws our attention. It is something that pulls our attentive faculties in a sense that we tend to burn a lot of energy trying to make sense of it. Some of us may even get a little obsessed and compulsive about doing certain things till we can gain something out of it, till we skill. If you've ever seen somebody that likes skateboarding, that started the skateboard feeling by watching somebody flying through the air ever so gloriously and landing a trick, an ollie, among other things. I'm not sure which trick that is anymore. It's been so long. But whenever somebody sees that and then they associate with it, there is something that makes them feel good inside. Then there's pursuit. There's also that release of dopamine that's feel good. And there's this sense of projection of self into the future that I can see myself possibly doing that, maybe doing that, or seeing myself doing it, fantasizing. And the more I fantasize about it, the stronger the feelings get because I want it. Now, these are really important points as far as learning, because when we get to the point where we find something and we're just enamored of it, we are in love with it, we're excited, we are wanting to do that, live it, be it, and experience the joy and fun of that sort of freedom. This is when we run into our involvement where we want to commit to starting it. And these are important things. Often whenever we're learning a skill, if we find them difficult or realize there's pain involved in learning something, we may avert learning the skill. We may stop and say, I'm not doing that. That kind of hurts, especially if we're afraid. And mind you, the way we see things, the visual memory, vicarious learning has to do with visualizing and observing and sometimes even fantasizing and using our mental capacity to think and remember what we saw on top of our making a constructed memory. Once again, the baby with the beard. Baby doesn't have a beard, but mashing those two things together that I've seen in my life, I've constructed something that does not exist, but made it something that is compelling and something I can react to. Not unlike this, whenever we're learning, we tend to fantasize ourselves on that skateboard or on that set of skis or maybe on a jet ski or running a football or kicking a ball or passing it, whatever it is we may be thinking about. And yet it hasn't happened yet, but we're starting to respond to it as if it's real. That compelling nature of our visual capacity is involved in vicarious learning too. Not only novelty, but the dopamine payoff. Dopamine is not the only pleasure chemical, but dopamine is really particularly important because it's also not about feeling good, but motivation. Whenever you have that, it's not just about do this again. Wow, that felt good, but find it again, do it more often, and develop a stash. And this is where it can become very dangerous, for instance, whenever it's involving drug use or some sort of dependence or addiction that develops, whether it be behavioral like gambling, process addictions, wherever you go through certain steps to get to a certain result that may or may not pay off. Gambling is particularly dangerous because it's a variable payoff schedule. If you win really big once, then after that you continue to go back pursuing that high, so to speak. And sometimes when we discuss things along the lines of addiction and people that say that they, in quotes, maintain or they're just maintaining, that means they use and the use doesn't feel good, but they need it just to function. That's what the hidden word is within maintain or maintenance. It's not about the peak and the high, even though they're seeking that and hope that they get it and they don't. Often there's other substances they may start seeking to try to get a high similar or a higher high, or maybe sometimes there's an excess of use wherever our body drives, wherever we aren't thinking more is better, but the body sees bigger and assumes it's better, bigger, shinier, therefore it must be more tasty, more sweet, more comforting because it's larger, the amount. That's where we get lost in believing what we see. That's why sometimes when we're hungry and have gone a long way and we might tend to fill our plate too much or try to eat too much, not knowing that our eyes are bigger than our stomach at that point. And that's an important thing because when we learn by observation, we don't always reason, but we follow what it is that feel good is, but also it can lead us astray. Often by observing, we may note that when we're hungry, we may overeat. When we're not eating often enough, that we tend to be hungry longer. We tend to make strategies based on trying to alleviate that discomfort of hunger, the pain of hunger, this sort of thing, and the weakness and everything else that goes along with that. And we start thinking about things, but we also start worrying about things. And that worry is a projective idea of myself in the future hurting and us trying to avoid it by stopping the pain. And often we may seek things that give us pleasure that may not be healthy for us, or do things at a level where we may take in excess, maybe alcohol, maybe drugs, or some other painkiller, or maybe even food, or too much gambling where you risk the house, or maybe sex, wherever you take and do risky things like jumping out of perfectly good airplanes with parachutes, this sort of thing. And we may find ways to, in excess, find that dopamine hit, find a way for that adrenaline to come in addition to the dopamine, just to feel better or to alleviate how we may feel. If it's depressing, if it's anger, if it's upset, if it's anxiety, we try to alleviate those things. Now, that was a long spiel running because it's all kind of connected. And what I'm going to do is go back to the levels of learning, the unconscious incompetence rather, to the conscious incompetence, where we start and where we run into that wall of, do I have the wherewithal, the means, and maybe the interest and intention to gain this skill such that even the discomfort won't dissuade me. If you have drugs in particular and you have a particularly strong high and is incredibly pleasurable, chances are you're going back. If you've gotten really, really inebriated and you had a really good time, and usually you're pretty uptight, but then you become the life of the party, this sort of thing, and you like the attention, the feel good, more than likely you're going to go back and do that again. You may develop new behaviors, creatively develop new behaviors based on observation. Observation of whom? Maybe how other people have done, or maybe how you've interacted in an environment that is novel, new, and interesting. So you've observed yourself and realized that you've gained something that was pleasurable. The things that we do and repeat often start off as a very pleasurable experience. Often they start off as some sort of relief or seeking relief, and the relief worked. It happened. It actually relieved my discomfort, changed how I felt, how I saw myself, this sort of thing. So it's a really important thing to pay attention to. So the conscious incompetence is the step before you get to the conscious competence level. Conscious competency means that you're aware of it and you've gained some skill in it, and you might continue to do it because, well, that's not so bad. Kind of like riding a bike the very first time. I've seen bikes before, but I've never rode one. Then we get to riding, we may fall a few times, wreck into a few trees, and people laugh, and then we get up, haha. But depending on how bad the wreck is, we may or may not get back on that bike. The important thing is, if you do get back on the bike, at some point you get very skillful, and you may do things where you might drive really fast. You might start jumping ramps the way I used to with my neighbors, and it was always fun. The longest I think I jumped was half of a yard, which would have been an actual front yard, let me say, diagonally. And I think it came out, almost wrecked into the tree, at the neighbor's house. That would have been probably about 30 feet. And I was probably traveling about a good 25 miles an hour in the street by the time I hit the ramp, and I landed, and that was the harshest landing I ever had. But the only thing that kept me from not doing that again, because I landed rather hard, and my seat, my bottom, will never forgive me. But the fact of the matter is, my friends and their acceptance and their excitement because I landed, and I was kind of feeling like a hero at that point. And some of them were younger than me, some were a little older, some couldn't do it or were afraid, but I did, and it's kind of happened. Wow. All of that, in spite of the pain, the discomfort, and I ran the risk of splitting my head open on that mesquite tree, was worth it. And I did it again several times after that, mind you. But the important thing is that there was some sort of payoff that allowed me to get past my initial fear of physical failure or injury, and I had a willingness to try. So as far as that goes, whenever we learn and become skilled, we can get really, really good at things. Now, whenever we get to a level that we are learning, there are a number of little things that are occurring, but over time, when we become more masterful, I don't like the term mastery or final mastery, because being a student of the Chinese martial arts for many years, and other martial arts too, but I started in the Chinese arts first with Wing Chun and Tai Chi Chuan. That is the exercise that most of the elderly folks do in China, but I learned it as a martial art and as a health art as well. And I gained skilled with those, and it took time, but I was never put off by the discomfort, and the training is rigorous to say the least. But whenever I got to those things, something triggered inside of me that I've never left them. I always gained something good, and it was more than just the physical fighting skills. It was more than just the recognition of what I was doing and having something particularly unique to the area I lived. It wasn't for a pat on the back. There were many times I trained alone, and I toiled in silence and quiet in the dark, in the garage when I worked overnights unloading trucks for years, trying to provide a living for my three little ones, my family. And there were times that I wanted to quit because there was nobody to train to test my skill or level. And that was painful, emotionally painful, because I lived far away from my teacher that was in Hawaii when I met him. I got out of the military, and in the area of West Texas I was in, there weren't any people really interested in doing what I did. And the only people that were interested in doing anything along the lines of what I did were kind of criminal in mind and wanted to just fight and hurt people, which I wouldn't tolerate that. And I just remember one day asking God, hey, if you want me to train this stuff, you sent me across the world to learn this. I learned it. I'm picking it up. I want to take care of it. I want to do it. And I love this, but I need people to train me. Within about 6 months, I was still training. I didn't quit. I started very serendipitously, very luckily, very synchronistically running into people that were training, that were some people from New York, from New Jersey. There were some that were coming in from Lubbock in Texas, others from California. And just driving through, one from Philadelphia, whom is still a great friend to this day, 30 some odd years later, 27 years actually. And this is one of the things that I learned and I got very good at. I'm not tooting my horn, but mastery, not quite. I'm not a master. I'm a practitioner for many years. I'm good at teaching people, and I can get people to protect themselves pretty well. But the important part I'm making is that I got to the point of unconscious competence with my skill. But it's not a final arrival that you stop and you maintain the skill. All these skills are perishable, and if you don't move them, you don't do them, you lose them. You may have the understanding you can coach somebody, but if you're going to be able to do that, you got to be able to perform these movements as well to be able to demonstrate, or else you lose the heart of the art for the most part. And as an example is the fact that I have taught these skills even whenever I've been injured, and as long as I was able to largely perform what I was doing, I was able to transmit the skill and the information. So I really enjoyed that. But how much did I learn by watching? Well, everything that I learned by watching. You can learn by reading, and that's okay. But there's certain things that you can only get the feel for by actually toeing the scratch with somebody and having crossed hand situations wherever you may not really challenge somebody to a death match, but challenge somebody to train and test you and to really put some heat on you a little bit, not trying to kill you, but just to see if your hands work, your legs work, your stances work. And that's pressure testing, and that's important. Now, I will say that over time, I've had the opportunity, and not necessarily anything I looked for, but when the opportunity came up, I've had to use my methodology, and it doesn't come out the way it looks when you train. But the nature of what you train, your spirit, your body, reactivity, and your control of yourself, body, mind, and spirit, mind you, it comes out. The way you train is the way you fight. The way you train is the way you survive. And sometimes the training wasn't always about physical aggression. Sometimes it's about getting out of the way of things whenever the environment is dangerous, like things falling, and getting out of the way and being resilient and be able to take damage unnecessarily. Is not a good thing, but whenever you take damage in the sense that your body can roll with it, you minimize or mitigate the effects. So there's a whole lot you get out of it. Also, there's a way to mitigate the effects of mental, emotional abuse and traumatic intent when somebody's trying to harm you and trying to hurt you. And the training has worked at the physical level, the spiritual level, and the emotional level as well. And that is definitely something that I have gained from these levels of competence over time. Some of these things that we have to say are skills, we learn very young. And we have to understand that there are certain skills and behaviors that we ask, like our children when they come home from school. Who taught you that? Where did you hear that? And you didn't hear that at home. And we have to understand that children assume behaviors. And an assumption is basically taking things at face value without question. And whenever we assume behaviors when we're too young to question, and we will mimic a behavior, that is an assumption of behavior, but maybe not of principle that drives it if there's a reason for it behind it. Like whenever we go to church, that sort of thing, we wonder why somebody curtsies or kneels or bows, and we just do because everyone else does, but not understanding what the meaning is or what the rule or guideline is that would that would guide that behavior. So there are many behaviors that we assume, and sometimes those behaviors when kids come home from school, and we as adults do this as well, we tend to emulate people, not meaning to, not intending to. Whenever we have people that talk, sometimes they pick up an accent not knowing. Whenever I came back from Hawaii, came back to West Texas, I definitely had a difference in accent. People that I know that have lived in Okinawa have come home, and their accent sounded very choppy, very different, and very Japanized, so to speak. Not a derogation, but just the fact that the influence and the rhythm of the speech influenced them as much as the culture did. So important things to note, but we assume behaviors. Sometimes behaviors are caught, not unlike a contagion of sort, and sometimes they're taught formally, where somebody shows you the steps. But in between the caught and the taught, we have the observed, where the behaviors we pick up are intentionally picked up closer to the taught, but we're teaching ourselves. And then we have those that we pick up that are closer to caught, and that we assume them when maybe we learn them too young to be able to question whether or not they're good for us or what it is that we're doing. And some of the most disgusting stuff that I see now is where we have people showing videos of little ones saying bad words or even flipping the bird, this sort of thing, and taking that as cute. And to me, that's not okay for a little one. I think we need to allow them to be children and not inculcate them in adult misbehavior. But such are my principles. But beyond that, the reason I want to talk about this is because everything that we learn within a continuum of unconscious incompetence rather, to the conscious incompetence, and then finally to the level of conscious competence at the very least. And we run into these ideas based on interest. Sometimes novelty. Is it new? Is it shocking? And I didn't even get into the negative or the traumatic aspect of this, because sometimes, like an octopus is known for being incredibly intelligent for what's called one-shot learning. And when they do that, we note that they're able to pick up skills at first blush, and they feel it out, but they also have 8 arms that are like having 8 different brains, so they have a different cognitive capacity the way as humans do. But yet, whenever we look at problem-solving capacity, we have that ability to one-shot learn when we're under duress and stress. Rarely do we pick things up just out of novelty and fascination first thing, unless it's just that incredibly exciting. Often, like with PTSD and post-traumatic stress reactivity, if one thing happens, we may not learn the learned helplessness. We might over time. That's from a long overwhelm and inability to change the negative circumstance. But whenever it comes to learning how to avoid something immediately, sometimes those things that are traumatic, the learning occurs at a very simple, singular event level, but then gets generalized, and we extrapolate the meaning of that throughout many different things that even slightly resemble that event. And then that's when we start having issues along the lines of post-traumatic stress disorder. So much to think about. This is a deep topic, and I'll be hitting on it some more as we go. I certainly look forward to talking to y'all more about this, but I appreciate your time, appreciate the interest, and I thank you for all of you that have been reaching out to me and saying hello. And I want to say that there are a number of channels out there that have been grabbing my interest just simply because they're human interests. Some are fun and funny. But one in particular, a gentleman from Staten Island, and his name is Sam Alkatib. If you ever watch his stuff, look up his channel on YouTube. He has grown incredibly, but a lot of wholesome stuff for family, but there's a lot of funny things in there that just make you think, and I certainly enjoy that content. Above that, I just want to tell you thank you for spending some time with me. I appreciate you being here with me, and also want to tell you that I'll be putting some more podcasts out there here soon covering other topics, but this one was one that came particularly hard Saturday whenever I was taking notes, and just want to go a little deeper into not only vicarious learning, but novelty in learning, but also the effects of the payoff, the dopamine in that learning, and how it tends to make our learning stronger or easier depending on the circumstance. And certainly appreciate you sharing your time with me. Thank you. Take care. Walk well.